In the work Insufferable Tools, Feminism Against the Big Tech, Sarah Sharma refers to Blue Origin's new Safeguard capsule rocket, which Jeff Bezos used on his flight in 2021 and which sparked intense commentary due to its phallic shape. The company's engineers explained that the design was dictated by considerations of aerodynamic stability and safe re-entry. However, as Sharma points out, the danger is that we might slip into a gender essentialism that directly equates the phallus with a supposed natural technological masculinity, a trap she herself systematically avoids. Nevertheless, I would argue that the issue is not limited to avoiding essentialism. The genealogy of the phallus concerns not merely an anatomical organ, but the historically constructed architecture of power. Moreover, it is precisely this phallic logic that we encounter in the neologism pornography, introduced in the 18th century by Nicolas Etmer and Steve de la Breton from the combination of the words prostitute and to write. As Paul Preciado emphasizes, the term does not simply refer to the representation of sexuality, but to a political and architectural plan for organizing the city with the aim of managing and restricting prostitution. However, the stakes of this plan went far beyond prostitution itself. It was a bipolitical architecture that sought to preemptively organize bodies, desires, and psyches within the boundaries of gender, race, age, class, and colonial power. The city was thus transformed into a technology of immunity and discipline, a space where the circulation of bodies, fluids, reproduction, and desire had to be constantly monitored and classified based on protection from the floods of common horse. Through this logic, colonial modernity linked the management of life to the extermination of indigenous populations, the exploitation of the earth and nature, and the discipline of the common whore, as well as of common forms of knowledge, autonomy, and collective life, in the name of a linear idea of progress, purity, and whiteness that continues to organize Western technologies of power to these days, extending to SpaceX and the Titan submarine, examples cited by the author for the sake of a stable machine. In this light, it is not coincidence that the history of reproductive technology has been linked since the 19th century to practices of violence against women's bodies. In 1884, in the first recorded successful case of artificial insemination, the Philadelphia physician William Pancoast anesthetized a woman who had sought medical advice together with her husband with chloroform and inseminate her without her consent using the sperm of one of his students, completely concealing the procedure from her. 9 months later, the woman gave birth. And perhaps it is precisely with this framework that in my reading something crucial lies in Insufferable Tools. Sharma shows that what is extracted is not only matter, labor, or data, but also the very possibility of forming relationships, time, and collective life outside of dominant technological logics and artificial intelligence. And this is precisely where the continuity lies between eugenics and today's digital infrastructures, not only in the management of bodies, but in the organization of the obedience of disobedient bodies and memory itself. It is in this sense that I read the fourth chapter, Broken Machines, toward the feminist technological determinism, on which I was primarily asked to focus. There, Sharma does not propose a better or more ethical technological world through the inclusion of more women, queer, racialized, or disabled bodies within existing technological structures. Instead, she proposes a radical challenge to the very patriarchal technologic that organizes the world. It is precisely here that the answer to the questions posed by the book lies. For Sharma, the concept of feminist technological determinism does not mean that technology mechanically determines society. Rather, it means that every technological form organizes the conditions of possibility for social life, politics, and even our imagination itself. In other words, this techno-deterministic critique of the media, especially when shaped by a feminist perspective, allows us to ask how, where, and to what extent different technologies alter the tempo, scale, and rhythms of life for various populations in different ways. It also provides an opportunity to theorize technology in a way that recognizes that the critique of technology takes place under the imposing authority of large technology corporations and their patriarchal structures, and that if we are not careful, its potential may be constrained by the mechanism of the patriarchal technostructure. In other words, it is not enough to move beyond binary gender identity. We must also dismantle the scientific hegemony of this whiteness that produces knowledge and power with the aim of subjugating humanity on a universal scale. That is why the problem is not only which bodies fit into the system, but which model of the human being is considered from the outset normal, human, and worthy of life. In this sense, Sharma does not simply reject technological determinism, but attempts to rephrase it in feminist terms as a way of understanding how technological forms themselves limit or enable specific possibilities of existence. And this is precisely where my own interpretation comes in, that technology does not function merely as a tool, but as a massive, eugenic, and warlike machine for the extraction of communal knowledge, kinship, and collective life for the benefit of this mankind, while simultaneously producing new forms of slavery and subjugation. In other words, to free ourselves from these technologies, it is not enough simply to demonize determinism, as the author explains. What is required is a genealogical investigation of the historical forms of power embedded in the technologies themselves. It is not enough to reject the theory while simultaneously rendering invisible the violence that shapes us. For even those who believe they are outside of technology are already shaped by the platforms, infrastructures, and patriarchal technological logics within which we live, recognizing our very selves through them. And within this framework, I propose that we cannot understand technology apart from eugenics. This scientific and reproductive technology that was not merely linked to forced sterilization, but was also closely linked to the logics of empire, racial capitalism, and colonial domination. As Edward Said reminds us, referring to Arthur Balfour, colonial power was always legitimized through the inseparable relationship between knowledge and power. Eugenics also functioned as a colonial technology of knowledge through which colonized populations were called upon to recognize themselves as inferior, underdeveloped, or insufficiently human in the face of a supposed universal Western rationality that was capable not only of interpreting human nature but, even more so, of imagining it technologically in terms of an artificial nature resilient to the needs of mankind. And it was precisely this technoscience that was presented as objective and neutral in terms of knowledge, something that gave rise to another form of continuous civil war under the umbrella of peace. After all, in the words of Louis Pasteur, knowledge is the heritage of humanity, the torch that illuminates the world. However, this universality was organized around standards of whiteness, normality, genocide, feminicide, and reproductive hygiene. This meant a science as defined by Francis Galton, the possibility of transforming nature into artificial nature, something that constitutes, as Alfred Binet reminds us through photographs from his laboratory featuring 10 boys of varying heights, an early eugenic fantasy of planetary consciousness. That is the exclusive rearing of the tallest and therefore supposedly most beautiful and intelligent child among the 10 through the prevention and non-reproduction of non-uniform beings. And this is precisely what kept coming back to me as I read the book. That technology often functions as a means of rendering invisible the very violence it produces. In this sense, inclusion within a technological structure that remains exploitative and toxic is not enough. As Sharma aptly notes, referring to RTX Corporation, which heavily promotes equality, diversity, and inclusion as corporate values, the fact that a company presents itself as queer-friendly, anti-racist, or LGBTQ inclusive does not negate its role in the production of military and surveillance technology. RTX manufacture missiles, bombs, fighter jet components, and surveillance systems used both by the Israeli military and along the US-Mexico border. As he writes, diversity, equality, and inclusion are not universal goods. At this point, Sharma critics engage directly with what has been called corporate or liberal feminism. The feminism of big tech companies, and prime example of which is Sheryl Sandberg's Lenin policy, constitute a feminist for the 1%. A corporate and capitalist feminism that remains deeply dependent on the undervalued labor of poor women as well as black and racialized bodies. This is a corporate, white, and bourgeois feminism that does not challenge the very technology of extraction and exploitation, but merely seeks to expand participation within it. Technology, therefore, is not merely a tool. It is an environment of power that shapes what is considered life, work, desire, normality, and community, but also who is ultimately entitled to exist. And this occurs through a continuous mutilation of forms of life, knowledge, and kinship in the name of reproducing a supposedly universal technological normality and uniformity. In this sense, mansplaining is presented not simply as an annoying interpersonal habit, but as a strategy of domination that exhausts others by assuming authority, occupying space and forcing marginalized people to spend energy defending their own knowledge and experiences. The author argues that ChatGPT and other large language models reproduce a similar logic. They confidently generate explanations by reorganizing vast amount of existing data, including racist and sexist assumptions embedded in dominant systems of knowledge. In this framework, ChatGPT becomes a technological form of mansplaining, a machine that endlessly explains the world with the appearance of neutrality and expertise. Universities are criticized for helping legitimize and normalize this system by inviting scholars to responsibly integrate AI into education, diversity initiatives, and institutional practices rather than questioning the patriarchal and extractive structures upon which these technologies are built. By rephrasing the social sciences as dehumanizing studies, she offers an iconic reversal of the humanities as introduced by Catherine Walsh. And here, a crucial question arises. How can there be refusal within digital infrastructures from which it is merely impossible to escape? Sharma uses the language of technology and machines to interpret the Me Too movement as a rupture in the patriarchal infrastructure of silence. The basic idea is that patriarchy relies not only on violence but also on isolation, on victims believing that they are alone, that their experience is unique, or that they will not find collective recognition. That is why this text argues that the real surprise of Me Too was not the existence of violence. Most women were already aware of it, but the fact that women spoke to one another publicly and en masse. The phrase machines will speak to other machines transforms women subjects into a communication network that suddenly bypasses patriarchal control on information. Broken machines do not simply want to regulate or improve AI and automated technologies. They want to challenge why contemporary society takes it for granted. The technology must take the form of automated assistance, continuous optimization, and the replacement of human labor and relationships. The excerpt makes a very important distinction between care in common and self-care. Thus, what is persecuted is not only an inferior body, but the very possibility of existing in the world as always more than one, as a community, as memory, as collective knowledge, and as disobedience against the patriarchal and colonial logic of uniformity. At this point, Sharma is, in my reading, very close to my critique of eugenics as a epistemic regime that permits today's technoscience, even though she herself does not use the term eugenics. Broken machines are a metaphor for people, bodies, and subjectivities that do not function smoothly within the dominant technological system of capitalism, patriarchy, and data extraction. The concept describes those who are treated like components of technological infrastructure expected to produce, communicate, optimize, adapt, and remain permanently available, but who instead experience exhaustion, exclusion, breakdown, opacity, or refusal. The term also reverses the usual meaning of broken. In mainstream technological culture, a broken machine is something inefficient that must be repaired and reintegrated into productive circulation, much like the phallic city imagined in the genealogy with which I began. A city organized around purity, discipline, and the exclusion of the common whore, and ultimately of the commons itself. This is precisely patriarchal technology. In this sense, the common whore can also be read as one of these broken machines. A figure marked as impure, excessive, and socially dangerous, precisely because she exceeds the reproductive, moral, and technological order of patriarchal modernity. But in this text, brokenness becomes political. Broken machines expose the hidden assumptions of technological systems precisely because they cannot or refuse to operate according to those systems' demands. Thus, the broken machine is historically akin to the slave, the pathological, the expendable worker, the colonized, and today's exhausted digital precarious subject. Thus, the book is not merely a critique of big tech. It is a critique of colonial modernity itself and the technological form that accompanies it. What is at stake is not only the projection of privacy or the ethics of AI, but the very possibility of resistance and the re-emergence of forms of life that will not be organized around surveillance, normalization, extraction, and compulsory productivity, beginning with the resistance of these broken machines. And perhaps this is ultimately the most radical point of the fourth chapter, that the feminist politics of technology cannot be content with reforming the machines. It must imagine the possibility of a different narrative of life, in which existence is organized not around the logic of replacement and utility, but around mutual irreducibility and collective coexistence. Thank you.